she whispered. "Don't touch me, I'm broken." But the rancher said nothing and rocked her baby to sleep. Colorado Mountains, late winter, 1882. Snowflakes drifted in the lantern light, settling like fragile secrets on the warped floorboards of the Midnight Lily Saloon. Inside, Grace Holloway stood tall on stage despite the pull of the child inside her and the tighter pull of fear wrapped around her ribs. She sang because it was the only way to drown the memories. Her voice, shaky at first, smoothed out into the melody. Applause didn't matter. Music was her escape. As she finished the final verse, the noise of the saloon swelled. Glasses clinking, boots scuffing, men laughing too loud. She stepped off stage, her heart pounding. A glass shattered nearby. Grace flinched. Laughter followed, cruel and careless. John Mercer leaned against the bar, watching her. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in his sheriff's coat, badge dulled by dust and whiskey. His stare held no affection, only ownership. "Drink for your courage, sweetheart," he called, sliding a glass across the table toward her. "Show everyone you're still mine." "No," Grace said, voice barely audible. His smile thinned. "That ain't how this works." She turned away. His hand struck the table. The saloon fell silent. Boots shuffled. Chairs screeched. She felt him behind her before she heard him. "You don't get to say no," he hissed, grabbing her arm. Pain flared. She yanked back and fell into a table. Blood filled her mouth. The room spun, then vanished. When she came to, she lay on a thin mattress in a darkened back room. Snow tapped the window softly. Her cheek throbbed. Her belly shifted beneath her hand. Still moving. Still alive. A soft voice whispered beside her. "Grace, you with me?" She turned to see Mabel, the old cook from the saloon, leaning close. Her face was worn, but her eyes were fierce. "You can't stay," Mabel said. "Not after what he did. Not with that baby coming." "I've got nowhere," Grace's voice cracked. "You got out. That's somewhere." Mabel pressed coins into her hand. "Take these. My old shawl's by the door. I'll walk you out." "Where?" Grace whispered. "There's a man, Silas Boone. Keeps to himself, runs a horse ranch halfway up the mountain trail. He doesn't ask questions." Grace tried to stand, faltered. Mabel caught her with surprising strength. "Now," the woman said, "before he sobers up." They left through the kitchen door, snow slapping their faces like ice palms. Grace wore the heavy shawl wrapped tight, her boots too thin for the cold. Mabel led her through back alleys, then into the woods. The silence of snow was louder than the saloon's music had ever been. Grace tripped often, leaning on Mabel's arm. Her breaths turned ragged. The wind howled through the trees like ghosts. After miles of trudging, a faint light appeared ahead. Mabel pointed. "That's his barn. I'll wait here. Go." Grace stared at the building. Tall, quiet, light spilling from the cracks in its wood. The door opened. A man stepped out. Silas Boone was tall, built like the mountains behind him. He wore a thick coat, his hat dusted with snow, his eyes unreadable beneath the brim. She froze. Her body curled inward. She had no words. He took one step closer. Grace whispered, "Don't touch me, I'm broken." Silas didn't flinch. His voice came low and quiet, like it belonged to the wind. "Then let me care for the pieces." He turned and opened the barn door wider. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and horses. Warmth from a stove glowed in one corner. Silas pointed to a small stall, clean and dry. He laid down fresh blankets, fetched a cup of water, and handed it to her without a word. Grace sat, every muscle taut. She watched him as he worked. Quiet, methodical, never once meeting her eyes longer than needed. When he stoked the fire, she whispered, "Why are you helping me?" He didn't answer. That night, she lay on the straw mattress, the baby shifting beneath her ribs, her breath slowing with the crackle of the stove. For the first time in months, no voice barked commands. No fists, no fear, just snow, firelight, silence. Maybe, she thought, This was what safety felt like. And before sleep took her, she whispered again, to herself this time, "Maybe I'm not broken, just bruised." By dawn, the storm had quieted, but Grace's heart still beat like hooves on frozen ground. Silas Boone said little the next morning. Justin pointed toward a small room in the far corner of the stable, a space once used for injured foals, now swept clean and lined with wooden planks. There was a cot of pine boards, its legs uneven, a patched wool blanket folded at its end. A pot-bellied stove sat in the corner, gently crackling with kindling already set. "This room's yours," he said. "Ain't much, but warm." Grace didn't reply. She nodded once, stepped inside, and placed her worn satchel by the cot. It was warmer than she expected. She turned and caught him glancing at the stove. "I'll bring more wood by evening," he added, then walked away. He didn't ask her name again, didn't ask where she'd come from or what she was running from. But each day, small gestures stitched a quiet rhythm between them. He repaired the latch on her door. He folded fresh towels outside her room. He left boiled water by the basin before dawn. Never spoke of it, never knocked. And at night, when the wind howled through the canyons and Grace lay awake clutching her belly, Silas never came near, but she could hear him, moving about the barn, checking the horses, stoking the fire. Just there. The room began to feel less like a hiding place and more like a pause, an exhale. Still, the ghosts lingered. In the silence, memories returned like echoes off canyon walls, laughter under golden lights, her voice drifting in harmony with piano keys, the thrill of applause and the heat of being wanted, for a moment. And then, the shift, the shadow that followed her off stage. John's fingers tight around her wrist, his voice slurring threats into her ear, his rage erupting, the moment she said no. She'd sung for coins, for adoration, for survival. And when she sang no more, he used his fists. Now, even in safety, every creak of wood made her flinch. Every silhouette in lamplight made her heart spike. She never spoke of it, but the fear didn't need words. It clung to her movements, her eyes. Silas noticed, but never intruded. Instead, his hands worked. He mended the broken strap on her boot, left it quietly by the door. He patched her coat's elbow and brushed the snow from her window ledge each morning. Once she found a wool scarf folded beside her pillow. It wasn't new, but warm, smelling faintly of cedar and hay. One night sleep wouldn't come. Pain coiled through her belly, tight, sharp, not dangerous but deep enough to steal her breath. She pressed her hands to her sides and sat up, teeth clenched against the cold and the fear. A creak on the wooden floor. Silas stood at her doorway, holding a folded quilt in one arm and a tin plate in the other. He didn't say anything, just stepped in slowly, careful not to cross the room. He set the quilt at the edge of her bed. Then, beside it, a plate of dry bread and a small cup of milk that steamed gently in the cold air. She watched him. He met her eyes only once. In the orange glow of the stove, his gaze held no question, no assumption, no weight. Just a quiet offering. Grace swallowed. You always take care of people like this?" "No," he said, "just horses, and sometimes folks who've been ridden too hard." Her breath caught. Not from fear this time, but something quieter. A pause. A kindness unexpected. He turned, his boots creaking, and left the room. Grace stared at the food, then the blanket. Her hands trembled as she lifted the cup. It was the first warm drink she'd had in weeks, maybe months. And as she sipped, something inside her, worn thin from flight and fury, unwound, just a little. That night, as the wind pressed against the walls and the pine trees groaned in the dark, Grace lay under the quilt Silas had left her, the scarf around her neck, her hands curled around her belly. She watched the shadows dance across the ceiling, and for the first time since fleeing John Mercer's fists, she did not tremble when she closed her eyes. The storm returned the night Grace went into labor. Snow drifted thick outside the barn, covering the ground like a heavy quilt. The air turned brittle, and clouds hung low over the ridgeline. Inside the stable, everything was still, until the pain came. It began as a tightness in her back, a low groan in her spine. By the time the fire burned low in her stove, her breath came in sharp gasps. Her hands clutched the cot, her forehead beaded with sweat despite the cold. She tried to muffle the cries, biting down on the blanket. She didn't want to wake him. She didn't want to need anyone. But Silas heard. She didn't know how long it had been when his boots sounded on the wood outside her door. He knocked once. "You need help?" he asked, voice calm, low. She couldn't speak, just nodded through the tears. He opened the door and stepped inside, not close, just enough. Behind him a second figure followed, a woman, older, wrapped in elk skin and smelling faintly of lavender and smoke. Her hair was in two thick braids, silver at the roots. "This is Numa," Silas said simply. "She's seen more births than snowfall." Grace could hardly focus, but she clutched her belly and nodded again. Silas didn't linger. He brought towels, boiled water, kept the fire alive. When Numa asked, he answered. When she needed something, he fetched it. And never looked away from Grace in pity. Never panicked, just did what needed doing. Hours passed. Cries rose and fell. Then, suddenly, silence. A moment stretched in the air, thick with anticipation. Then, a wail. Tiny, fierce, alive. Grace's chest convulsed with sobs she didn't mean to release. She couldn't lift her arms, couldn't see straight. But through her tears, she watched Silas step forward. Numa, smiling, handed him the newborn. "Girl," she said softly, "strong lungs." The baby fit into Silas Boone's arms like wind through canyon stone. He stared down, stiff at first. His big, calloused hands cradled her so gently, too gently, as if afraid he might break something just by holding it. He turned, stepped toward the stall doors, pushed them open a crack. From the paddock beyond came the soft clop of hooves, his horses restless in the cold, shifting on frozen ground. Silas rocked the baby to their rhythm. No songs, no words, just that steady, soft echo of hooves in snow. Grace watched, her body limp, her spirit unraveling, and yet her eyes clung to the sight. There he stood, tall, quiet, alone in the firelight, holding her child as if she were the most fragile and sacred thing on this earth. His hands trembled, not from fear of the child, but from fear that someone might think he was reaching too far, daring too much. But he didn't let go. Grace's throat tightened. He was the first person to touch her daughter, not with expectation or obligation, but reverence. Later, when Numa left and the barn fell into quiet once more, Silas laid the baby gently in Grace's arms. "She yours," he said softly, "no matter what came before." Grace tried to hold her. Her arms ached. Her milk hadn't come in. The baby routed against her, frustrated. "I can't feed her," Grace whispered. "I'm broken." Silas didn't answer. He didn't try to fix it with words. He just nodded, quietly, and left the room. She thought he was giving her space. She thought perhaps he had grown tired of broken things. But at sunrise, she woke to the sound of bells and hooves. Out the window, Silas was walking back up the trail, a small goat on a lead behind him. By evening, the barn was warm again, and he stood in the doorway with a pan of goat's milk, steamed gently over the fire. He didn't ask to help, he just sat, measured the milk onto a spoon, waited until the baby stirred. Then, with the same hands that had once pulled women from burning homes, he fed her slowly, carefully, one spoonful at a time. Every night after that he did the same. And though he never said a word about it, Grace knew. He wasn't just helping her survive, he was teaching her how to start again. The snow had begun to melt, leaving patches of wet earth around the stable and the distant scent of pine sap in the wind. Grace stood by the window, holding Lily close, watching the clouds roll across the Colorado sky. Peace had become a fragile thing, tender and unfamiliar, but she had started to believe in it, until the thunder of boots shattered it. It was late afternoon when the riders came, 4 of them, on horses too clean, boots too polished for the mountain dust. At the center rode John Mercer, wearing a deputy's badge like a crown. His face was tighter, meaner, more haunted than she remembered, but his voice hadn't changed. "I want what's mine," he barked as they approached the front of the stable. "That woman stole my child." From inside, Grace froze. She couldn't breathe. Her legs trembled. Her grip on Lily tightened. Silas had been in the barn, oiling a bridle. At the first sound of commotion, he stepped outside. His eyes swept over the men, landing on John, then on Grace, then back again. He didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't raise his voice. He just walked across the yard, silent as ever, and stopped in front of the cabin. Then, with slow deliberation, he pulled a long wooden box from under the porch. Plain, heavy, rough-hewn. The coffin. He set it upright in the snow and looked John square in the eye. "This," Silas said, voice deep and steady, "is what's empty when there's no love, no respect. This isn't what I give her, but it's where men end up when they forget what they are." A beat of silence passed, thick as fog. John laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's supposed to scare me?" "No," Silas replied. "It's supposed to remind you." Inside, Grace took a step toward the door, but her knees buckled. Her fingers reached for the latch, then recoiled. She didn't want to be seen like this, trembling, hollow, afraid. But Lily stirred in her arms, and something shifted. She opened the door, stepped out. Snow crunched under her boots as she crossed the threshold. Her coat flapped in the wind, her cheeks pale, but her jaw set. She stood a few feet behind Silas, breathing shallow, eyes locked on John. John's expression twisted. "You ran like a dog. Took what wasn't yours." "She's not a thing," Grace said quietly. "And I didn't steal her. I saved her." John started to move forward. That's when Silas took a step between them. He held Lily in his arms now, wrapped in a quilt Grace had sewn by hand. He didn't speak, didn't threaten. He just stood, tall, steady, like the ridge behind them. One of John's companions shifted in his saddle. Another glanced away. And then, from the trees beyond the paddock, Mabel appeared. Behind her came Numa, and 2 hands from the nearby ranch. One by one they gathered, not armed, not angry, just present, standing with Grace. Mabel folded her arms. "I saw what he did to her. We all did. You think this town belongs to men like you, Mercer, but we're not blind." Numa spoke next, her voice soft but cutting. "You want to claim what you tried to destroy. That's not justice. That's fear." John looked around. The weight of eyes was heavier than bullets. His bravado faltered. He cursed, turned his horse. "This ain't over," he spat. Silas didn't move. "It is if you walk away." John paused, caught in the moment between pride and self-preservation. Then he rode. The others followed, quiet now, not meeting anyone's eyes. As the hoofbeats faded into the hills, Grace sagged. Her shoulders heaved. Her hand found Silas's coat sleeve, clinging without realizing. He handed her Lily, gently. "You don't owe me anything," he murmured. She shook her head, tears brimming. "You didn't fight with a gun. You fought with honor." He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "That's the only kind of fight worth showing a child." The cold came early that year. Evenings at the ranch turned quiet, the air crisp with frost. Inside the cabin the fire crackled low. Grace sat by the hearth, Lily bundled in a woven shawl in her lap, suckling sleepily. Outside, the horses shifted in the corral, hooves brushing snow. "I used to sing every night," Grace whispered, mostly to herself. "Back in that tavern. It was all I had." Mabel, sitting near the stove peeling apples, looked up. "Still is, if you ask me." Grace shook her head. "My voice, it doesn't feel like mine anymore. Like everything else. He took that too. Mabel didn't argue. She just smiled faintly and tossed another apple peel into the pot. That night, when Lily fussed with a bellyache, Mabel leaned in and nudged Grace gently. Try humming to her, just a little. You don't have to sing, just remind her you're there. Grace hesitated. Her throat tightened. But then, in the dim warmth, she let out the smallest sound, more breath than melody, a whisper of a lullaby. Lily, my light, sleep through the night. The tune faltered, barely held together, but Lily quieted. Unseen from the back room, Silas listened. He didn't move, didn't interrupt. The next morning, Grace found a bundle wrapped in an old blanket beside the hearth. She opened it slowly. A mandolin, its body worn and cracked, but carefully restored. The strings gleamed new in the firelight. The wood smelled faintly of lemon oil. She turned to see Silas in the doorway, arms crossed loosely. His voice was low. Found it in the loft weeks ago. Thought it might still sing. Her eyes welled. She looked down at the instrument. You fixed it? He nodded once. She took it in her lap, fingers trembling. Her thumb brushed the strings. A shy chord emerged, hesitant and airy. I'm not sure I can play anymore. You don't have to, he said, turning to leave. But I figured if you wanted to, it should be ready. She stared after him, the weight of his words settling in. He hadn't asked her to sing. He hadn't pushed. He'd just listened. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep with a full belly and pink cheeks, Grace sat alone by the fire. The mandolin rested in her lap. Her fingers moved slowly over the strings. Trying to remember, Silas sat across the room, carving something small from a block of cedar. He didn't look at her. Grace inhaled. Then, voice barely more than a breath, she sang. Lily, my light, dream soft and right. The melody cracked but didn't break. It was fragile, like frost over glass. But it held. Her voice quavered on the second line, but the mandolin's gentle resonance steadied her. She looked down, barely breathing. When she glanced up, Silas had stopped carving. His eyes were closed. And when she finished, he opened them, just long enough to meet hers. There were tears there, quiet ones. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stood, walked over, and knelt beside the hearth. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder. Not gripping, not claiming, just there, solid, steady. Grace froze. Her breath hitched. Her body remembered all the wrong kinds of touch. But his hand didn't move. And for the first time, she didn't either. She let it stay. Lily stirred and turned in her sleep. Grace looked down at her daughter, then back at Silas. I thought I was broken, she whispered. He didn't say it out loud, but his gaze said it for him. You're not. She leaned her cheek slightly against his hand, and played one more chord. The snow had begun to thaw, but the cold lingered in the bones, just enough to keep windows shut and the nights long. Inside the cabin, the silence was deeper than usual. Grace sat by the window, her eyes dull, one hand limp in her lap while Lily whimpered against her chest, rooting but unsatisfied. Her milk was drying up. She knew why. Rumors had begun to drift up from town, brought by travelers, feed suppliers, and gossiping ranch hands. John Mercer was telling anyone who would listen that Grace had stolen his child, that she was mad, unstable, that Lily might not even be his. She tried not to listen, but words have weight, even when carried by snow. Even in silence they echoed. Her nights grew restless. She tossed, sat upright, paced, cried quietly when no one was watching. Her appetite faded. Her body tensed at every sound. And her milk slowed, drop by drop, until Lily's cries deepened, no longer comforted by the closeness of her mother's skin. One morning, Silas found her on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, eyes red. Lily lay against her shoulder, too quiet. Grace didn't look at him. She just whispered, I can't feed her. I'm failing her. Silas didn't speak. He simply turned back into the barn. She heard the sound of old hinges, of hooves shifting, of rope creaking. An hour later, he returned with a pail of warm goat's milk and a cloth. He knelt by the fire, poured a ladleful into a pan, and set it gently to warm. Grace stood nearby, watching, unsure. "What are you doing?" His tone was even. "Feeding your daughter." She flinched, not at the words, but at the tenderness they held. That night, he showed her how to warm the milk just enough, not boiling, just gentle heat, and how to test it on her wrist, how to dip a cloth, twist it, and let Lily suckle from its corner. She sat beside him on the floor, watching his large hands do something so soft, so precise. "You've done this before?" she asked. "No," he said simply, "but I watched, once, a long time ago." She didn't press. For 3 nights, Silas did it himself. He didn't ask for help, didn't explain. Each evening he came in with milk, warmed it, fed Lily slowly and steadily. Grace sat nearby, silent. She wanted to help, but shame wrapped itself around her ribs. "I should be the one," she began once. Silas looked up. His gaze was gentle, unwavering. "You are, just not alone." The 4th night, she reached for the cloth first. Her fingers shook, the milk sloshed in the pan, but she did it, wrung it gently, pressed it to Lily's lips, watched her daughter drink with greedy relief. Silas watched, not with pride, but with respect. "You're not broken," he said, breaking the quiet. "You're tired, and tired women don't need judgment. They need rest, and help." Grace blinked, hard. That night, when Lily fell asleep in her arms, belly full and breath steady, Grace looked across the fire at Silas and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer, but he rose, stoked the fire, and laid another log on the pile beside her before retreating to his bedroll. And as the flames danced in the hearth, Grace finally slept, dreamless and still. The first time Grace touched a saw, her hands trembled. The cedar plank was rough, uneven. She looked at it like it might splinter at the wrong word. But Silas only handed her a plane and said, "Let it show its grain." They were building a crib for Lily, together. Each morning that week, after feeding and chores, they returned to the corner of the barn where Silas had set up a workbench. He let her choose the wood, cedar because it smelled like warmth, and showed her how to sand, to measure, to cut. The first time her fingers grazed the edge of a blade, Silas gently turned her hand, checked for injury, and then said nothing, just nodded once, quiet approval. One afternoon, as they fitted the last rail into place, Grace leaned back, sweat on her brow, cheeks flushed from winter sun. "This is the first thing I helped build," she said, almost in disbelief. Silas ran his hand along the side of the crib, then looked at her. "And not the last." Those 4 words landed softly but deeply, like a stone at the bottom of a well, true, unmoving. Later that week, Silas returned from town with a parcel wrapped in cloth. Inside were old alphabet cards, a child's primer, and a slate board. Grace held the bundle like it was made of lace. "I thought maybe you might want a teacher," he said. Grace blinked. "I never really learnt myself, not well." "You will?" he said simply. In the evenings, after Lily slept, Grace sat by the hearth tracing letters. Silas would listen from the shadows, sometimes whittling, sometimes silent. One night, she took the chalk and carefully wrote Grace on the slate. Her name, for the first time, written by her own hand. And she smiled. As snow gathered in soft heaps outside, word came of a winter fair in the nearest town, small but spirited. Mabel brought it up first, eyes twinkling. "There'll be music," she said, nudging Grace. "Some real dancing, too." Grace shook her head. "I'm not ready." Mabel just smiled knowingly. "Darlin', no one's ever ready for joy. You just show up and let it surprise you." When the night arrived, Silas saddled the wagon. He didn't ask if she wanted to go. He only said, "I'd like to show Lily the lights." They rode into town wrapped in quilts, Lily between them. The square was strung with lanterns, fire pits burning at each corner, children laughing, fiddle music weaving through the cold. People turned when they stepped down. Some with curiosity, others with whispers. Grace felt the weight of 100 stares. But then Silas offered his arm, not as demand, but as presence. She took it. He held Lily against his chest, and together they moved through the crowd. Mabel waved from a cider booth. "You made it," she beamed. Someone handed Grace a warm drink. A fiddle started up again, soft, lilting. And then, almost without thinking, Grace stepped forward. Her voice was unsure at first, just a breath on the wind. But then it steadied. "Lily, my light. You came in the night, when all I could do was cry." The crowd hushed. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Not just through the air, but through every eye that had once looked at her with pity or suspicion. She finished on a long note, almost a prayer, and when it ended, the square stayed silent for one breath. Then applause. Gentle, respectful. She turned to Silas, heart thudding. And in that moment she whispered, "You're my home." He didn't answer, but he kissed Lily's forehead, then met Grace's eyes. That was answer enough. The road back from the winter fair was quiet. Grace leaned against the wooden frame of the wagon, Lily asleep in her arms, the stars overhead wheeling slow above the pines. Silas drove in silence, his shoulders broad beneath his coat, the reins loose in his hands. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't need to. Winter deepened, snow came heavy, but so did the warmth. Grace found herself humming again, little tunes while she cooked or rocked Lily. Silas repaired the back door, rehung the shutters on her room, sanded and resealed the floor. One morning Grace woke to see the window beside her bed framed with a fresh layer of pine. Outside she planted bulbs, tulips, lavender, daffodils, with Lily crawling nearby in a little knit hat. Each action was quiet. There were no grand gestures, but every moment felt placed with care, like stones forming a path home. Silas didn't call her wife. He didn't ask her to stay. But one morning, as the first warmth of spring broke across the ridge, Grace opened her eyes to the soft clatter of hoofbeats. On the small table by her bed there was something new. A ring. It wasn't gold or polished. It was carved from smooth ash wood. The inside burned with 3 tiny letters. G-L-S. Grace. Lily. Silas. She picked it up gently. Her breath caught. When she turned, Silas stood in the doorway, not quite looking at her. "It's not a promise you ask," he said quietly. "But it's all I have to give, and all that I want you to have." She hung up the phone and picked up the receiver to point at the screen. She stood slowly. Her heart didn't race this